A neglected child is not always someone who is obviously mistreated. Often, it is a child whose emotional needs are not consistently noticed or responded to, and this has a quiet but lasting effect on how their mind develops. Because children learn who they are and how the world works through the way others respond to them. So when attention, comfort, or validation is missing or inconsistent, the child begins to adapt in practical ways. They may stop expressing their needs openly, become more self-reliant than expected for their age, or learn to keep their emotions to themselves, not because they don't feel deeply, but because they are not used to those feelings being acknowledged. And over time, this can lead to difficulty understanding and expressing emotions, since no one helped them label or process what they were feeling, which is why many adults who experience neglect say they feel numb or unsure about their own emotions. And another common effect is a tendency to believe that their needs are not important, not in an obvious or conscious way, but in a subtle habit of minimizing themselves, avoiding asking for help, or feeling uncomfortable depending on others. And while this often looks like independence, it is usually a learned response rather than a natural preference. And in relationships, this can show up as hesitation to open up, difficulty trusting others to be emotionally available, or a pattern of giving more than they receive, simply because asking feels unfamiliar or even wrong. At the same time, many people who experience neglect become very aware of other people's moods and behavior because they had to pay close attention to small changes growing up, which can make them empathetic but also overly cautious. And understanding this pattern is important because it helps explain behaviors that might otherwise feel confusing or frustrating. And it also shows that these patterns are learned, which means they can be unlearned with time, awareness, and supportive relationships. And while neglect may not leave visible signs, its effects are real, shaping how a person relates to themselves and others, often in quiet ways that only become clear when looked at closely. And as this child grows older, these early adaptations do not simply disappear. They become part of how the person approaches everyday situations, often without realizing it. So in school, work, or friendships, they may naturally take on a role where they expect little and handle much, avoiding situations where they would need to rely on others too heavily. And this can make them seem dependable and low maintenance. But it also means their own needs often remain unspoken and unmet, not because others refuse to meet them, but because they're never clearly expressed in the first place. And over time, this creates a pattern where the person feels overlooked or unappreciated, even in environments where support is available, simply because they have learned not to ask for it. And this can lead to a quiet frustration that is difficult to explain, a sense that something is missing without fully understanding what it is. And in closer relationships, this pattern can become more noticeable, as they may struggle with vulnerability, finding it difficult to share personal thoughts or emotions openly, especially if it involves depending on someone else's response. And even when they do open up, there may be a tendency to downplay their feelings, to present them in a way that feels manageable or acceptable rather than fully honest, because there's still an underlying expectation that strong emotions may not be received well. And this can create distance in relationships, not because there's a lack of care, but because there's a lack of clear emotional communication. And at the same time, they may be very attentive to the needs of others, often noticing small changes in mood or behavior and responding quickly, which can make them supportive and understanding partners or friends. But this attentiveness can also turn into overthinking, where they try to interpret every small signal to avoid misunderstanding or conflict, something that often develops from growing up in an environment where attention was inconsistent and small cues had to be read carefully. And another common pattern is discomfort with receiving care, where acts of kindness or support may feel unfamiliar or even undeserved, leading them to deflect, minimize, or quickly return the favor rather than simply accepting it. Because accepting care requires a level of openness that was not reinforced earlier in life. And this can make it harder for them to fully experience closeness, even when it is available. And in some cases, they may also set very low expectations for how they should be treated, tolerating situations that are not fulfilling or even unhealthy, simply because they're used to functioning with less. And this is not a conscious choice, but a continuation of the same internal logic formed early on, where needs are reduced rather than asserted, and recognizing these patterns is a key step because it allows the person to begin separating past experience from present reality, understanding that the lack of response they experienced before does not necessarily apply to their current relationships or environment. And from there, change can begin in small, manageable ways, such as practicing clear communication, expressing preferences, or allowing moments of dependence without immediately pulling back. And while this may feel uncomfortable at first, it gradually helps build a new sense of trust, both in others and in the idea that their needs are valid and worth expressing. And over time, this shift can lead to more balanced relationships, where giving and receiving are not one-sided, and where emotional presence is not something uncertain or rare, but something that can be expected and relied upon. And although the effects of neglect can be long-lasting, they are not fixed, and with awareness, effort, and the right kind of support, it is possible to develop a more stable sense of self, a clearer understanding of one's emotions, and a healthier way of connecting with others that is not shaped only by what was missing in the past, but by what is possible in the present.